Hello, and welcome to Don't Shout at the Telly with me, Fraser Myers. Today's topic is rule by judges. Is there too much judicial interference in our politics? We're delighted to be joined by Luke Gittos, legal editor of Spiked, criminal lawyer, and director of the City of London Appeals Clinic, who offer free pro bono legal assistance. We're also delighted to be joined by Alan Hudson, who is the director of leadership and public policy programmes at the University of Oxford, and has been working since the 1990s on a survey around the relationship between the citizen and government, and in particular looking at the ways in which the working class have been sidelined from public life. I'd also like to welcome all of our volunteers to the discussion today. Luke, would you like to kick us off?
Thanks, Fraser. I'd like to talk about two recent high-profile examples where people have said that judges are interfering in politics, both in this country and in America. The first example I'd like to talk about is the recent decision around Brexit and the invocation of Article 50. And then I'd also like to talk about Trump's migrant travel ban and the challenge brought by the state of Washington. So starting with the Brexit decision, what happened was that immediately after the vote for Brexit, there was a period of lull where no one really knew what to do next. It was very clear immediately that the government had absolutely no plan for how to react in the case of a leave vote. The result of that, I think, was the intervention of a legal challenge by the claimant Gina Miller and others. There was a series of claimants who brought this particular challenge, funded by a network of funders who we didn't know an awful lot about. And Gina Miller's challenge to the High Court was to say that the government, led by the Prime Minister Theresa May, could not invoke Article 50, thereby beginning the process of leaving the European Union, without a vote in Parliament. Now, this challenge raised an awful lot of debate and discussion about what the role of the judiciary should be in the process of Brexit. But I think the way that the discussion unfolded tells us a lot about the relationship between citizens and the government and Parliament and members of Parliament, which I think was very interesting. It's right to say that the judges in the High Court and subsequently in the Supreme Court did not choose to hear this particular case. The case was brought by Gina Miller and others who had a right to bring that case. The reaction to the case, I think, was also at times quite problematic. So you had the Daily Mail putting pictures of the judges on the front page, calling them enemies of the people, which I think was hyperbolic and I think a little bit wrong because, as I said before, the judges did not choose to hear this case. However, on the other side, there was this quite laughable set of commentators, particularly from the legal profession, who decided to pretend that this case had absolutely no political motivation whatsoever, and that Gina Miller and the rest of her claimants were simply interested in resolving this interesting constitutional question. Obviously, that's not true. This was a case brought with a political end in mind, which was to force a vote on the invocation of Article 50, and then hopefully, from Gina Miller's perspective, to hold up the process of Brexit through a parliamentary vote and then subsequently through the House of Lords. But what I think the discussion really illustrated was how little we trusted our MPs to act on the result of this vote. There was a significant discussion that emerged after the vote about what the proper role of your elected representative is. Do you send your MP to Parliament to use their judgment and to use the result of the referendum as a guide as to what they should do, in effect leaving them free to vote against the result of the referendum if they thought that that was in their interest? Or are they directly politically mandated to carry out the result of the referendum as an expression of popular democracy? I side very strongly with the latter of those two conceptions. I think that when MPs go to Parliament, they don't only act for their constituents, they also act for society at large. This represented the biggest political mandate ever in British history, and so I think now MPs should see their role as carrying that through. I'd like to mention briefly the example of America and Donald Trump. So what's happened is that Donald Trump has signed an executive order issuing a temporary ban from 7 majority Muslim countries for immigrants coming into the United States. What's happened is that the state of Washington has launched a legal challenge in the federal courts saying that this order is effectively unlawful. And the judges have upheld the first order judges' ruling that the order should not be implemented until the legal questions have been resolved. I think actually this presents a bigger problem and says more about American democracy than the Brexit case says about British democracy, arguably. Because what you have in the States is judges directly interfering and saying that this policy cannot be passed as a matter of law. Now, I hate the migrant ban. I think it's awful, arguably racist, deeply inhumane, implemented with incredible incompetence. You know, people left in the airport not sure what their legal position was, people on holiday not being able to come back into the country. None of this has been thought about. However, the fact that the policy has been held up as a matter of law rather than as a matter of politics exposes, I think, a real problem at the heart of American democracy, which is that judges in the States have enormous power to intervene and prevent policies being enacted on the basis of constitutional challenges and other legal challenges as well. It goes back to the American idea of checks and balances, which was a big part of how the American Constitution was set up. And I think that the American example shows how judicial interference in politics can actually prevent democratically popular policies from being enacted. In the UK, we are going that way in some respects. The Brexit decision, as history shows us, did not do that, but I think the less power they have as undemocratically accountable individuals, the better.
It's not the fact that elected representatives within Parliament having a say on this. Does that not strengthen democracy by giving them the chance to talk about the issues and to make sure that they are implementing the decisions for their constituents who voted them into office and gave them the chance to represent them on the basis that they were professionals?
I'm really glad that you brought up what's happened in America. Some could argue that firstly, Donald Trump lost the popular vote and the Muslim ban isn't democratically popular amongst the American people. So in that sense, is it wrong for the judges to be able to have a say in that sense and challenge something that I would argue is not democratically popular within the American people?
It becomes very problematic when you say that this policy is not democratically legitimate because Hillary actually won the popular vote. Trump won the election through the established Electoral College rules, and those rules exist in order to accurately reflect the interests of various states in their constitution. Whether you disagree or agree with the Electoral College, he won the vote, and he is now carrying out a policy that he promised to do. So it has democratic legitimacy. The question is then whether you think that a set of lawyers should be able to intervene and prevent that democratically elected policy from being enacted. I think it creates all sorts of problems. Firstly, it creates the idea for the majority of people who voted for Trump and who might actually agree with the policy that their opinion and their vote as expressed in the ballot box doesn't matter, because no matter what they vote for, there is a chance that lawyers in the state of Washington will intervene and go against what they've decided. That creates a real problem because people feel disenfranchised. They don't feel as though their involvement in the democratic process ultimately matters, and that creates real problems.
The fact that there is like a divide, you could even say, between the public and the politicians and the judiciary and the government, really. How do we get past that disconnect?
Yes, there is a disconnection between the political class with the public, which are often seen as sort of ill-informed, xenophobic, often racist. So I almost feel that the law is almost filling in that vacuum, which I suppose that's why now we have cases like the HS2 being decided in courts or assisted suicide. But then it also leaves room for campaigners like Gina Miller, which is extremely powerful, with a lot of money, to then rush to courts to try and overturn the result. Because, if more and more political issues are decided in the courtroom, that surely is going to affect our democracy.
So you said that we thought the Daily Mail headline was that the enemies of the people. That is quite a hyperbolic headline. But on the other hand, are they really the friends of the people? Can we really say that judges can ever be neutral? So historically, the judges, are they not simply sort of parasites on the sort of current political class? Now, a lot of people might say that, for example, the recent judgment on Hillsborough, for example, where people say, well, they came to the right decision, but it was 20 years later than really they should have done. They lagged behind, and they're only really reflecting, that political establishment.
I think Luke raises very interesting points about the American Constitution. It's made me think a little bit. So you've actually got three traditions here. The American tradition, which is very formal, and I think that's why the Supreme Court plays a different role, is that it's actually empowered to interpret the Constitution separately from either the legislature or the executive. The European tradition over-determines the role of the state, which is what's the great thing about the British parliamentary tradition, is we win our liberties against the state. Whereas the tradition of the European Court of Human Rights and all of these is that the state guarantees our liberties, i.e. they're the ones that we should look to rather than to everybody in this room. And for me that was the great thing about the referendum, and why there's been a stalling of it, is that we announced, as a Brexiteer, but as part of a democratic polity, is that we weren't interested in the formulations from above. So practically speaking, I would have said the government bottled it and gave the onus back to the legal tradition by refusing to implement it immediately. The battle where it should be, which is in the political voices of all of us, as opposed to a legal tradition, which should tell us whether or not we're guilty of robbing somebody else's house, not how we understand the values and trajectory of the country, our sovereignty, our trade, every significant question of policy.
The American Supreme Court and a lot of the American courts do seem to have a much more politicised role than our courts, but there are a lot of striking examples of judicial activism and judicial interference and judicial sort of changing of the law. In particular, someone like Lord Denning comes to mind, who is sort of infamous for shaping the law as he saw fit. I've even heard him referred to as the people's judge, which is bizarre, but he would often support employers over trade unions. I think even later on in his life he'd say that some black people aren't fit to serve on juries. It still seems to be the case that our law, it can be subject to the prejudices of certain unelected individuals.
Well, a few of you have spoken about other political decisions like HS2 and some other decisions where it appears as though the judiciary are interfering in what should be political decisions. So it's perhaps worth reflecting on why they are able to do that. I think there's a couple of trends we could look to. The first, I think, is if you look at the level of law, when Parliament passes legislation nowadays, I think there is a greater trend towards giving ministers power that is deeply qualified. And often that means that they are dependent upon the approval of third parties, particularly of experts. In order to make a decision, you have to go through various legal steps in order to make it. I think that speaks to some degree to a retreat of our political leaders in making authoritative decisions around things and being able to say, well, I'm using my ministerial judgment to make a call on how to treat our healthcare or other areas of public life, and instead I'm going to delegate out the authority for making this decision to other third parties, experts, accounting bods and all the rest of it. For example, in HS2 and in other legal challenges, what you will see is that what they're reviewing is whether or not the minister has the power to make the decision that he makes. And frankly, I think it's a problem if ministers don't have power to make decisions, because although we might disagree with the decisions that they make, they should be held accountable in the political process. They should face electoral consequences to their decisions. I think the intervention of judges reposes these questions as legal ones when really fundamentally they're a question of politics. That goes on to a couple of questions about enemies of the people, the role of judges in our society, etc. I mean, judges aren't meant to be radical. They're meant to be conservative. The role of the judiciary is to ensure that there is some continuity about the way things are done. In our system, we have a common law system which says we've done things the way it's for hundreds of years or not, and this is the way we should approach this particular issue now. So don't look to judges to be sort of the radical change setters in society, because that really is not their role and arguably never has been. What they have done in the past is make decisions which arguably legally reflect the changing social attitudes of the day. So the law catches up with social and democratic changes that have already occurred.
In my opinion, I think it's right to give the people the chance to have their say. Obviously, that's an inherent part of democracy, but I think it's up to the press to ensure that the information that reaches the people is accurate and doesn't contain lies. And I think when people make decisions based upon lies, it is not actually to their own benefit.
I believe that people should make decisions, but they need to be very educated, know about the politics as well. I totally agree. But they also need to have very strong educated backgrounds and very strong opinions on what they want, not just do it for the sake of it.
It should be just a small amount of maybe wise or very educated people. Not everyone, not just all the people make a decision, because actually it's not about who makes the decision, it's how we can make these decisions into practice. It's just like everyone make a decision and now it's like the Brexit is stuck.
I don't really agree with what you say, because I think that the people should make the decisions for their own destiny. That's what democracy is about.
I also believe that people should have the say in such decisions. It doesn't necessarily have to be people who have strong academic credentials, but in the concept of being informed, having the information accessible to them, and the media bringing that information to them in a truthful and honest manner. When they do make decisions, they are informed, not based on, I guess maybe in the case of Brexit, we had a lot of rhetoric around immigration and things like that.
Like Tony said, everything should be accessible to everyone, so that not only the educated people are informed, everyone is also informed, not misled with no misleading facts and statistics that are all carried out and thoroughly checked.
There's been a lot of talk about how people need to be better informed and we need to make sure that they're not being lied to or tricked or whatever, but I would ask yourselves, do you think that you're easily persuaded by lies? You know, do you think that you're stupid and gullible? And then you should also ask, well, why do I have these prejudices about other people? People aren't so easily led in that way, and you understand that if you look at your own friends and you look at yourself, but we often, say these things about other people that we don't know. And I truly believe that obviously it is only the people who should be making major decisions about the destiny of our country and the trajectory of our society. And I think all of the really great gains that we have had over the last 100 years or so, they have come through the public's engagement with politics and people's attempts to shape society as they see fit. They haven't been handed down from judges. The more involvement that the public have in democracy and the more opportunities that they have, not just have their say, but really to impose their will on public life, I think the better.
I'm absolutely shocked by some of the things I heard in this room. In the past, when there was the Levellers and other groups trying to extend the enfranchisement and the right to vote, to a lot of the arguments used to stop working class people, men, women, from voting was the same arguments being said in this room. It was the lack of education, was the fact that they were easily brainwashed, they were emotional. That shocks me. People are not just monkey see, monkey do. People reason. There was a poll that said after Brexit that actually people don't trust the newspapers when it comes to making the judgment on the EU. People interacted with their peers, they interacted with their neighbours, they discussed, they took this very seriously.
Like you said about working class people, I feel that often the youth are neglected, and I feel that what the decisions that are made in Parliament and by older generations, the youth should have that power as well, seeing as they're the most affected generation. They're going to be living in this country supposedly for the longest out of the generations. My personal experience, the people around me at my age can be seen as more informed and more aware of the decisions that are made, the effects of those decisions on them, and I feel that we should have a voice and a say in those decisions.
This word people, but who are these persons we are talking about? I think that history proved that democracy was a big step towards progress, but I also think that democracy has been abused as a term, because sometimes decisions are related to lack of knowledge, lack of education. It's not a degree that makes you better than someone else. It's not attending a high school or being part of a middle class instead of a working class, But obviously, we have to make sure that with media and education, we can arrive to these people, so-called people who I heard we were talking about.
Yes, but how would you qualify a person to vote then? How would you?
Well, this is the issue basically. It's difficult to evaluate how prepared is a person to vote or not. I don't want to eliminate people to
So they
this
have to
whole
pass the
system.
test.
No, it's not about the test. It's not about the test. It's to improve the system. It's not that from today or tomorrow I would say, okay, you are not able to vote, so go home. No, it's about improving the education system, improving information to make people more aware about what's going on outside there and take the right decision there.
So accessibility, well, first of all, if you want real accessibility to, what's going on, then you need to argue for free speech. Yeah? Because that's the only way that you can have all those ideas out there and people can make their own minds up when, what is the right way. The youth of today does not argue for free speech. They like to censor it, in my opinion. So I think we first of all need to stick up for that. The other thing is that if we're arguing about that people are overly influenced by the media, if you look at the Brexit vote or the Trump vote, that's just not true. Poll after poll has shown it's those that voted to leave or those that voted for Trump that have no truck with the media. They're the ones that are suspicious of the media's intentions. They don't trust them. The people that tend to trust the media are those that voted to remain, those that sort of are more than the middle classes. Who is in the best position to understand through their lived experience of the hardships or what really affects people, that where things are not what they should be? The working people. They are far better qualified because I don't think a lot of people really understand the rubbish that other people have to put up with in their lives.
I agree with Marissa on what Tony said. The stigmas that were too emotional or were too immature to vote, it's not something that you can actually use because, as you said, there are people of our age that are actually informed, that know what we're talking about. We know, we've researched it, we know, because it's going to affect us in the future more. And saying that a small amount, it's taking us back decades, taking us back centuries, when only a certain amount of people, you had to have a certain education, a certain qualification, a certain heritage to vote, to get your opinion out there, whilst people who were living it day to day couldn't say what they wanted to say, couldn't live and do what they wanted to do because of what a certain amount of people that are supposed to speak for the majority were thinking.
Democracy to me is like it's got to be the working class people. They've got to make the decisions for themselves.
I think that was what's so great about the Brexit vote, is that it was a moment in history, and they do come around ever so often, when the people took a decision which was contrary to what they were being told they should make. And I'm afraid that all too often, when I heard people talking about the informed decision, why haven't they made an informed decision, they need better access to information, what people were really saying was they'd reached a conclusion that we didn't like. And I think that was a key tendency to emerge after the Brexit vote.
The most interesting thing about this discussion, and I respect right across the board, is this is a political discussion, not a technical one. So we're having an argument about how we understand the world and society. We're not presuming that somebody else understands it better than us, because it's nothing to do with technical expertise. If you go to a hospital, the surgeon makes the decision about you having an operation, but you are part of making the decision about how much money goes into the National Health Service. It's not a technical thing, it's a political thing. The distribution of public goods, which we're all responsible for. In fact, we should be more responsible for. Because one of the things that's happened over the last 40 or 50 years is the exclusion of most of us from the political process, because it's assumed that experts know more than us. And that's an old argument. It's an argument which has been around since the French Revolution, when people emerged historically. And even in Britain, there were people with two votes until after the Second World War. Oxbridge graduates had 2 votes. And effectively, some people here are arguing for a return to a system like that because they know more. Well, they don't.
Discriminating against the working class can also be it's parallel to discriminating against youth. So I feel youth should have just as much as a say as working class, and as well with those who may or may not be educated on the issue.
Can I just ask very brief? Are you arguing that the vote should have been for a younger age, or let's say
the
16?
minimal age, yeah.
Okay.
I think that in terms of generational gaps, there were the older generation who were aware of the time when we joined the EU, And then I would say then there are people like myself and probably Tony who who've only known the EU. And for me, what helped me to decide to vote as a Brexiter was to be informed about what the EU actually stands for, what the institution means, not just freedom of travel and the opportunity to cross borders, which I think is what maybe we think about, not really some other deeper issues. What did the EU do to Italy, Greece, how did they treat other parts of Europe? And that really helped me, and I would have loved for that to be a more commonplace conversation.
Yeah, I think a big problem with the run-up to the referendum was that people shouted, immigration, that's the problem, we must get rid of immigrants, they're destroying our system. And I think it's about making sure that the right arguments reach the people. And with Brexit, it was more an argument about, should we follow the views of UKIP and Nigel Farage, and that's why David Cameron initially called the referendum, to appease UKIP supporters from this rise of nationalism, which is, in my opinion, very dangerous. In a democracy, it's about making sure that the sub-alternative views are heard, and like the famous quote says, I'll fight to the death for your right to say your opinion, even though I disagree with it, I think it's about making sure that people are heard, and for me, in this argument, it's a big issue is whether judges are impartial enough to respond to the views of the people, and I think that is a big concern at the moment.
Magnus, on your point about immigration though, according to a poll straight after Brexit, actually immigration came second as the main reason why people voted Brexit. The main reason for most people was sovereignty, was actually having control over your own laws. And in your second point about UKIP as well, think about 3 or 4 million people voted for UKIP, whereas for Brexit, 17.4 million people voted for Brexit. Yeah. So you can't use the argument that, most people that voted for this was because they were UKIP supporters.
I think what's interesting about what you've been saying is that there's a real reluctance to take on UKIP or nationalism at the level of argument. And I think people are hoping through sort of legal structures like the European Union, as something that could preserve a kind of form of free movement, a racist form of free movement, in my view. There is a reluctance to tackle these problems head on in a political way and, say, persuade people of the value for example, freedom of movement. No one in public life will make the case for it. They'll simply assert that if you disagree, you're racist.
Just quickly on immigration, I think what the vote was for was certainly a vote against the EU's model of free movement. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest it was a vote against immigrants. I think there was a lot of common cause between those that voted Brexit and immigrants. In fact, a lot of the people I spoke to saw that the reason why the EU was interested in free movement was to facilitate business interests, very significant business interests across Europe. The reason that I think immigration and sovereignty came top of that poll was because immigration has been introduced largely behind people's backs, mass immigration into this country under the new Labour government. It's become a symbol in a lot of people's minds for a disregard of how people feel. And I think the unfortunate outcome of that is that now it's become almost weaponised. It's the issue through which we discuss sovereignty, which is difficult because it involves just debating the lives of migrants, people coming here wanting a better life. It involves discussing their right to be here in the context of legal sovereignty. I think what I would like to have is a political culture where we can discuss immigration and attempt to win people over to a particular worldview around immigration without saying that you have to feel this way about immigration, otherwise you are prejudiced or racist or whatever.
I'm unsure of the question of whether or not there should be a lower age for voting. I don't necessarily think even if you did it would solve the problem, because you are perfectly capable of having an argument with either your parents or older people about what your opinions are. But I think behind it there is a presumption, and I think this is a rather pessimistic presumption, is that anybody who's closer to shuffling off this mortal coil, by dropping dead, has got no interest in the future. I mean, it denies the fact that most of those people have either got children or grandchildren, and they're still making points about what they want the future for their children to be, which is one of the reasons that I voted for Brexit, because I thought Britain would be better out, both because it would be a more free society and probably a more prosperous society, but I don't want to go there. I wanted to raise the issue here of the presumption of our political class, and I use the word class rather than elite because I think they're all pretty mediocre, I don't like using the term elite, is that we are racist. And it's largely not the case right across our society. In fact, historically, it's the political class which is racist, and we get on with most people. And there are people who are prejudiced. In terms of race relations, it is now legalised. You can't have a upfront discussion with somebody without being accused of having a hate crime, which is then means that it then becomes a judicial procedure rather than one between adults. And I think that's another example of the inflation of the law and the loss of autonomy of many people.
It's important that the voice of the people who voted is heard. So how would you say that we demand our political representative to stand up and step up in their leadership role to ensure that our voices are heard without having any interference by lawyers or those who would like to dwarf those plans?
You say that the judges have too much power. So then what aren't the politicians doing? What's going wrong that the politicians have to pass it on to the judges?
So I want to see more discussion, more debate and more confrontation because, for example, recently there was that gay cake scandal where a bakery in Northern Ireland was punished in court for refusing to bake a cake with a pro-gay marriage message. But what I thought was really interesting about the whole case was the fact that the activist, so the person that ordered the cake, instead of actually engaging in a discussion with the bakery and the owners of the bakery and try to change their, backward ideas or just their traditional ideas, no, they looked into the law to try and change minds. But can the law really change people's minds? Because as you rightly pointed out, Luke, the law can't lead. So I find it quite interesting that now loads of activists, instead of engaging on a one-to-one discussion, they prefer to bypass that and call the state, or in this case the law, to intervene on their behalf.
With the issue, I understand how it arose because it's religion versus gay rights, but it depends on what the issue actually involves. Like, it's about a cake, and obviously if it was a serious, much more serious situation, like if there was a fight or violence broke out, then obviously the law would have to get involved. But because it's about a cake, because it's like calling an ambulance because you can't open a jar of pickles, because apparently someone did tell me a story about that. Someone did actually do that. And I just thought it was ridiculous because you can't really waste really important people's time because of food. The law doesn't really need to step in.
It's more to do with the principle, it's the wider view of which is right and which is wrong, and if the law should have the right to say which one's right and which one's wrong.
Judges are declaring that gay rights trump religious freedom. That is a political discussion. Which is more important than the other is something for us to argue about. It's not something that should be decided by judges.
The way I understand your question, it actually relates to the title of this whole series, is Shouting at the Telly, is that we experience our relationship to the public realm as individuals rather than part of different collectives. They won't be the same collective. And what we've got to try and do is reinvigorate our sense of how we engage with other people in public. The problem is there is no organisation which adequately represents a significant part of our society anymore. You can see that both in terms of the lack of participation in elections, but also the fact that for the first time for 50 years, the two major parties actually are almost a minority of the population. Now in the past, and you can't recreate this, members of parliament, whichever party they were in, were under the pressure of people who they lived with, either through work at the trade unions or through churches or through social movements. So there was a constant pressure. And they were largely hollowed out and eliminated and not been replaced. And this is why the media and focus groups and think tanks get disproportionate influence. They represent no one, but government constantly tries to relate to people through organisations which are self-invented. So we've got to reverse that process. We've got to go round all of those things and engage as citizens. Now the problem with this, and I say there is a problem, is none of us have got the time to do that all the time. But we have to make the effort, because otherwise what will happen is that everybody will presume there is no argument about how to distribute what we have, and it's only a technical solution, and we'll give it back to the experts. And our leaders will be happy with that, because then they don't have to engage with us.
So should we have more referendums then?
Yes. I think we should have more direct democracy, and we should be asking the people what their view is as often as possible.
I think it's difficult to make a plan for how to a fixed plan, whether it be through more referenda or anything else, for how we reconstitute our democratic relationship with the people that rule over us. I think what the Brexit vote did is throw that open for the first time in a long time. And I think as the reams and reams of EU legislation are peeled away and our representatives are forced to come up with policies for things that they had previously delegated out to the EU, I think that's going to open up new opportunities for democratic engagement. One thing we can do is attempt to repeal some of the laws which give, I think, judges too much say over issues in public life. And I think that's actually very straightforward. We can repeal the Human Rights Act, which is a case which gives the European Court of Human Rights greater say over political matters in this country. There's all sorts of legislation we can repeal which limit people's right to freely express themselves. So a lot of the legislation that supports our framework of hate crime, which Alan is right, has been used recently to really stifle political debate. I think getting rid of those laws would be a very clear, straightforward thing we can do to withdraw the role of the law in our political life. But finally, I think the gay cake example is a good one to finish on, because it shows the impact of public life when the law moves beyond its normal remit and attempts to set the tone or set the parameters for public engagement. Because what happened in the gay cake case was that nobody changed their mind about anything. The bakers kept their conviction that they should not bake the cake in support of gay marriage. They ended up with a fine and probably deeper resentment of the couple that had come to them in the first place. The couple that had gone to them didn't get their cake, as far as I know. They had to go to a different baker's. So no one won. And the reason no one won is that what was effectively a disagreement about how a particular area of public life should be resolved was removed from its place in the public sphere and placed in the courtroom. And the courtroom can resolve the question of who the law should favour, but it can never tell you what is right and wrong. It can never answer that question. It can never answer the fundamentally political and moral question as to whether they were right to refuse to bake that cake. That's a question that we have to ask. And the more we ask those questions, the better.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Huge thanks to Luke Gittos and Alan Hudson, and to all of our volunteers. If you'd like to take part in the next edition of Don't Shout at the Telly, please email us.